are we going to do a little bit of a roundup of some of your stuff? You've spent many years on this topic. How much more is there to know? Because you've painted the clear picture, and there's other people out there with different ideas, but I think your research stands out as being the go-to one with regard to especially your Rubber Soul work, which proves really that there's no way they could have come up with those songs for that album in that 30 days, whatever it was.
I did it for 8 years, and I covered all the ground that I believed that I needed to cover, and it came full circle. I was telling Billy the other day, periodically what I do to update my website is to count up the number of views on my Beatles content. And previously, I only used to count the views on my 2 YouTube channels. So there's The Sage of Quay, which is my main channel, and then there's my Beatles channel, Mike Williams, Paul is Dead. And I would count the views up between those 2 channels. The views were 5 million between my 2 YouTube channels, with my Paul is Dead channel making up 3.6 million of the 5.
Assuming these views are correct as well, because we know numbers get different.
Yeah, well, YouTube suppresses my views. I've known that for a long time. I've caught them a number of times pulling views out, but it just is what it is. So I'm just going to go with whatever numbers are there. But you're right. I mean, they do suppress. But what has really worked for me over the last year and a half or so is Rumble. There is no suppression of the views. What I noticed is when I put my Beatle content up on Rumble, it takes off. So I'm getting 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 views per video. Whereas if I go back to YouTube, it'll say 5 to 10, maybe 12,000 views. Well, that same interview or that same presentation did 30 or 40,000 views on Rumble. The reason why I'm telling you this is because I added my Rumble views as well. So the new number, the number of total views and listens to my content since inception, since September of 2016 through November of 2024, last month, 6.5 million.
Have you not done BitChute and Odyssey as well?
I do BitChute and Odyssey, but the numbers there, they're decent numbers there. But I can't count everything because I have to actually do it manually. So I take the big hitter platforms and I'll add those numbers up. Plus, it gives me buffer, Billy, because there's always going to be some nitwit that's going to say, I don't believe that your number is really 6.5 million. And like, well, I'm just counting 3 platforms. If you want to tack on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon, you can go knock yourself out and make the number bigger if you'd like. People ask me all the time, you think more and more people are getting it? And my answer is yes, more and more people are getting it. More and more people who are critically thinking, awake, they get it. There are still, well, obviously there are people out there that believe that the Beatles were what the narrative tells them, this great, fantastic, magical band with all of this chemistry, 2 greatest songwriters of all time for pop music. So you have that segment, which is huge. And then you've got, within the Paul is Dead community, you have these other researchers that they like to focus on Paul being replaced. Not that that's not important, because Paul was replaced back in 1966, but they don't want to go back in time and they don't want to take a look at the true creation story of the Beatles. They don't want to talk about that because they want to believe the Cinderella story. They want to believe that the Beatles were this organic, natural group, these 4 guys from Liverpool connected in with Brian Epstein, and then Brian got them a contract with EMI under the tutelage of George Martin, and then they went on to unparalleled fame and fortune. They want to believe that that entire process is organic and real. If you think that way, then you really don't understand, as Jordan Maxwell used to say, how the world really works. And we just went through those charts and showed the corporate span of control and the pyramid of power. To think that the Beatles did what they did organically, at least up to a certain point, because some of them will say, oh, well, the deep state got involved when Billy got involved. Before that, the deep state was sound asleep at the switch. They allowed this band to climb to tremendous heights, and then they decided to do something with him.
It just got on the Ed Sullivan Show to an audience of all of America.
Exactly. They just happened to wind up on the Ed Sullivan Show and have all of the media attention that they got, which was really unparalleled at the time. That was a natural occurrence. It's not a natural occurrence, but the thing is, the researchers that continue to focus on that, and they want to say that Mike's wrong, the Beatles wrote their music, justice for Paul McCartney, He was a brilliant songwriter. John was a brilliant songwriter. George would chime in once in a while. They want to believe that stuff. Look, it's a fairy tale, or plain and simple. Believing that story is no different than me telling you that a 300-pound guy in a red suit and a white beard can slip down a chimney with a bag of Christmas gifts. It's the same thing. It's not how the world works. And to continue to believe that and then say, well, you're a Beatles researcher, you're missing a big piece of what it is that you should be looking at. I mean, you're only playing half the football field. So in the United States, for those who don't know, American football is 100 yards. Many of them started at the 50-yard line and went right, but they didn't take a look at the 50-yard line going back left to the very beginning. In fact, Billy, if you want to throw up one of the slides, it's the one. It's the 1960 to 1963 timeline.
Is it that one?
That's it. So to try to drive the point home, based upon what I was just talking about, here's the Beatles timeline from 1960 through 1963. So the Beatles go to Hamburg in August of 1960, and they're not very good at all. And it's not just me saying this. This is well documented. The Beatles themselves have talked about this. When they got to Hamburg, they were not very good musicians, marginal at best, and they showed no songwriting skills, none. And so in August of 1960, John is 20, Paul is 18, George is 17, and at that time, Pete Best is their drummer. So they are young, inexperienced, and they are rough around the edges. They are a bar and club band. And in fact, in the Beatles documentary, The Complete Beatles, their manager, Alan Williams, who was their manager at the time, tells a story where he was trying to get them into clubs in Hamburg, and he was told, don't bring that bum group, the Beatles, to Hamburg. They spend August through December of 1961 in Hamburg, and it's a flop. It's a failure. In Joseph Niesgoda's book, Lennon Prophecy, he explains that both Paul and John come back home dejected because absolutely nothing materialized. But then something very interesting takes place. Starting in 1961, they start to book all of these club dates, and they're performing just about every day. I mean, they have maybe a day off here or there, but it's very consistent. They keep going along, booking all of these performances, these live gigs in these bars and these clubs, both, locally within Liverpool and outside of Liverpool. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, who's doing all this booking? How is this happening? This is a band that just spent 4 months in Hamburg and fell on their face. They come back home and all of a sudden you're getting all of these gigs. So all of these gigs continue from 1961 up through when they arrive in America on February 7th of 1964.
Do you think that's when the Faustian deal was done?
The Faustian deal, according to memoirs, was done on October 24th of 1963 after the release of their first album, Please Please Me. So we've got the Beatles now, right? So they're coming off this big disaster in Hamburg, and now they're getting all these gigs booked starting in 1961 through 62, 63, and like I said, heading into when they landed in America, which was called the Beatles Conquering America. So we can talk about that a little bit too if I have time. But not only that, they have an audition with Decca on January 1st of 1962. So 1961 doing these live gigs. They're still not a very good band. They're a bar and club group. They land an audition with Decca, major label. And we're told that they did 15 songs, 3 of which were original compositions, Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Loved of the Loved. None of these songs saw the light of day on any of their albums released while the band was together. So that tells you something about the quality of those songs. They wound up on the anthology series. I think at least 2 of them did. And Decca turns them down. Decca says, no, not interested. So then Brian Epstein takes tapes to George Martin in February of 1962. And George Martin, who was with EMI, and he's the head of the Parlophone label, George Martin actually was running Parlophone. He was running the Parlophone label. He was given the label to run at the age of 29. So they had big things slotted for George Martin. So Martin listens to the tapes, and he says, nope, if you want me to decide based upon what you're showing me, I'm not going to sign them. So now they're rejected by Decca. They're rejected by EMI Parlophone. At that point, right after George Martin says no, now the Beatles somehow wind up on the BBC. So in March of 1962, after flopping in Hamburg August through December of 1960, not getting the nod with the Decca audition, not getting the nod by George Martin, now they're playing their BBC gigs. And they played their BBC gigs from March of 1962 through May of 1965. How did that happen? How did that happen?
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting one.
Yeah, you do not get on the BBC, a major media outlet, unless you've got a machine behind you. So then what happens is EMI, George Martin have a change of heart. That's because George Martin, according to memoirs, was told to take the Beatles on. So in June of 1962, that's when their contract with EMI is signed. And there's a lot of speculation as to why George Martin had that about face. And I won't get into, all the details here. I'll just tell you that my perspective is that at that time when George Martin turned him down in February of 62, he was not yet brought into the loop as to what the Beatles were going to be and what they were going to be used for. So what happened, though, was when George Martin signed them and brought them on, he didn't work with them right away. He assigned that to Ron Richards. Ron Richards was an assistant or associate producer working with George Martin, and Ron Richards actually went on to go produce the Hollies. And he worked with the band in the studio, and he couldn't get anything out of them. So when George Martin came, and I think it was Brian Epstein to listen to the playback, it was obvious that they weren't going anywhere because what they were listening to on the playback, what was recorded, was not very good. And that's when George Martin received another phone call. And he was told, no delegating. You've got to take this band under your wing, and you're going to be responsible for them. You're going to manage them. You're going to be their producer. So it was from that point on that George Martin was connected at the hip with the Beatles. And he played a very, very, very important role in making the Beatles what they became.
He was known as the fifth Beatle.
Known as the fifth Beatle. So I have another chart there, Billy, if you can show the George Martin chart. So these are all things that George Martin said. I have all of the audio and interviews. I just mentioned that when Brian Epstein showed him the tapes back in February of 62, he said to Brian Epstein, if you want me to judge them based on what you are playing me, I'm sorry, I need to turn you down. And then he said, on meeting the Beatles in 1962, I wasn't terribly impressed with the first stuff they did. And then in the documentary produced by George Martin, he's talking to Howard Goodall, who's another composer and broadcaster and very accomplished. And he said, they had this wonderful charisma. They made you feel good. But I thought their music was rubbish. And then George Martin in another interview says that even though they had really nothing behind them, they were still fairly irreverent. And then he said, so I looked at these four guys and thought none of them shines above all the others. Now, this is an interesting thing to say, right? Because if John Lennon and Paul McCartney were these fantastic songwriters and writing songs all the time, in fact, in the Complete Beatles, it tells us that John Lennon and Paul McCartney, either individually or together, between 1956 and 1962, wrote 100 songs. They weren't recorded, but they wrote 100 songs. Yet, George Martin is saying they had nothing behind them. He said, Love Me Do was the best song I could find from them. I was very conscious it wasn't the big hit I was looking for. In fact, when George Martin first had the Beatles, when he was told to take them on, one of the first things that he did was to go look for songs for them to record. And then in another interview, he said they certainly had no, and in this interview, when he says this, George pauses because now he has to measure his words very carefully.
He's going to say discernible talent.
He says it wasn't too obvious they could be songwriters at this stage. Love Me Do was the best thing they had. And then he went on to say their songs were awful.
But Ringo involved at this point?
Ringo came on board. If you go to the chart that has the Mercy Beat article. So this was an article that was published in the August-September 1962 edition of Mercy Beat. And the article talks about the Beatles changing their drummer. So Pete Best is out and Ringo is in. But in that article, it says, the Beatles will fly to London to make recordings at EMI Studios. They will be recording numbers that have been specifically written for the group, which they have received from their recording manager, George Martin. So the picture I'm painting, folks, the story here, is that the Beatles weren't these four genius, brilliant musicians, and Paul McCartney and John Lennon weren't these prolific genius songwriters. They were a creation of the Tavistock Institute that had linkages back to the Frankfurt School, Theodore Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, that whole group. And as I mentioned to Billy previously, Tavistock created the Beatles, along with the Rolling Stones and many other bands that came out of the British invasion, to take down traditional values, to tear it down, and to also attack and dismantle institutionalized religion, in particular in the United States, that would be Christianity. That is what the Beatles' mission was, and they were going to do it through music. And the creation of the Beatles was another cultural Marxist entity. Cultural Marxism is Marxism that subverts from within, versus what I refer to as Lenin Marxism, which is revolution-based and denoted by violence. The Bolshevik Revolution, as an example, would be an example of Lenin Marxism. But the Frankfurt School, which came into being at the same time as the Tavistock Institute in the 1920s, they had a different take, and they were Jewish Marxist intellectuals. Their approach was very different. They said, look, this whole thing where it's violent is not going to work. Because after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Marxists actually thought that they were going to be able to convert the rest of the world to Marxism. Workers unite. But the Frankfurt School had a different take on this. And by the way, the Rothschilds hail from Frankfurt, Germany. And there are many German Marxists that have come out of Germany, including Marx himself. So the Beatles were a creation of this Tavistock Frankfurt School ideology, social engineering initiative. The Beatles were the first band created for the sole purpose of social engineering at a worldwide level. So what we could do now, Billy, is if we can go to the Norman Smith article. So Norman Smith was their engineer from their first recordings. We'll go by their albums, Please Please Me Through, Rubber Soul, starting with Revolver. Their seventh studio album, it was Jeff Emerick. Norman Smith did an interview with New Musical Express in 1971. New Musical Express, the editor, was a guy by the name of Roy Carr. I'll talk about Roy in a bit as it pertains to Phil Spector. Very important. So Norman said that he was not impressed at all when the Beatles were recording in the studio. His musical doubts, meaning their musical ability, was backed up with Love Me Do. He said, we had a hard time working on that one. And he said that they failed in the studio. This is their engineer. And then he goes on to say that the Beatles talked their way into a contract. So this is the fictional aspect of the story that we always get, right? So we get the truth if you read between the lines, and then what they do is they puff it up, they pump up the tires. You can't talk your way into a contract. EMI was the major label. I think it was the largest label in the world at the time. You either had it or you didn't. They were not going to waste their time with somebody giving you a bunch of words and trying to talk their way into the door. Not going to happen. He said the same thing that George Martin said. They had so much personality and so much magic about them. Right? George Martin said they had charisma. This is what it was all about. It was about shaping them to be charismatic, for them to have charm. They didn't care about the music because they weren't going to write the music. They weren't going to record the music. That was all going to be done by the Tavistock EMI deep state team. And in all likelihood, Theodore Adorno was overseeing that operation, with George Martin being the managing director of that operation. But we will get to Phil Spector in a moment. He said we did their first album, Please Please Me, in one take. Now, in the article, he says that they were awful and they failed in the studio. And then Norman Smith turns around and says that they completed the first album in one take. We did the whole album in a day. That's how we did it back then. Well, how they did it back then, when they did an album in one day, was to call the studio players in. And the studio musicians would bang out the songs. The sheet music would be put in front of them, and they would just cruise right through it. That's how it would get done in one day. It wasn't getting done by a band of four guys that the sound engineer was saying that they were awful and they failed in the studio and they couldn't get Love Me Do down. That group of people did not record their first album in one take. And the story goes that it was 10 songs recorded in a single day in February of 1963. 4 other songs were recorded earlier, and they were brought into the 14 tracks when they released their first debut album, Please Please Me, on March 22nd, which is the Skull and Bones number 322. It's also Genesis 322. For those of you who have your Bibles, read 322, and you'll understand what that also is representative of.
So, not also say that Ringo couldn't do the drum part or something in that.
George Martin hired Andy White to play the drums, And George Martin hired more than, in my view, than just Andy White to do the drums. He just talked about Andy White. And in an interview that, in a discussion, I should say, that George Martin had with Billy, a.k.a. Paul McCartney, and I believe it's in the documentary produced by George Martin, George is telling the story of when the Beatles came into the studio. He said, well, who's that guy? And he goes, well, that's the drummer. He's talking about Ringo. And George Martin says, well, no, he's not the drummer. That's your drummer over there. I paid good money for that guy. He's talking about Andy White. But George Martin says something very, very important, and he didn't realize, I think, that he said it. Now, he's talking to Paul McCartney. When they came into the studio, well, if Billy is Paul McCartney, he would have been one of the guys that was in the studio. George Martin would have said, when you and the band came into the studio. He said, when they came into the studio. So that's another clue that Billy is not Paul McCartney. If you go back to the timeline chart, let me just finish up there because there's still some important stuff there that I wanted to take the audience through. So now the Beatles didn't have any songs. Okay, George Martin said the best thing they had was Love Me Do, and that's if they even wrote Love Me Do. So they have no songs, and that's as of June of 1962. And then, 9 months later, they come out with their first album, and that first album contains 8 original compositions, 6 covers and 8 originals. So a band that had nothing behind them, the best thing they had was Love Me Do, again, if they even wrote Love Me Do. Now all of a sudden, magically, has the skills and the expertise to pen and record 8 original compositions. Then, 8 months later, in November of 1963, their second release, after Please Please Me, with the Beatles, was released on November 22nd, 1963. It's the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. 8 more original songs and 6 covers. So we have this band that has shown no indication or proof of songwriting skills. Their producer acknowledges that they didn't have any songs. And now all of a sudden, after June of 1962, after George Martin takes them in, 16 original songs pop out between the 2 albums, Please Please Me in March of 1963 and with the Beatles in November of 1963. And I can go on and on and on with this. Now, for somebody not to question this is amazing to me. Absolutely amazing to me. Just bring that chart up one more time, Billy. I want to go through that box in the bottom left in yellow because there's some important information there. If we use August of 1960, when the Beatles first arrived in Hamburg, as the stake in the ground and then move forward, here's the elapsed time. So again, they showed up in Hamburg, marginal musicians at best, a bar and club band, and not a very good one, and they showed no indication of songwriting skills. Hamburg to the Decca audition. They did that in 1 year and 4 months. From Hamburg to the EMI contract in June of 1962, 1 year and 10 months. From Hamburg to the release of their Please Please Me album, 2 years and 7 months. So if we take a look at some of these dates, it's absolutely not believable. Hamburg to when they arrived in the United States, 3 years and 5 months, roughly 3.5 years. So this nondescript bar and club band in August of 1960, with no indication or proof of songwriting skills, finds themselves in America on February 7th of 1964 with 2 albums under their belt. So I don't know, maybe it's just me, Billy, but there's a lot of questionable activity taking place. Now, I told you I'd talk about Phil Spector. There was an interview that was sent to me by one of my listeners, a very, very interesting interview, that Roy Carr from New Music Express, he interviewed Phil Spector in 1976. And that interview made its way into a music publication out of Australia called RAM, R-A-M.
Which is the title of Paul McCartney's first album as well.
It's interesting, right? And McCartney has it was his second release, his RAM album. In that interview, Phil Spector said he played a major role with the Beatles in the development of the Beatles. In fact, Phil Spector goes on to say that he was one of the main players in making the Beatles what they became. And he also said that, and Roy Carr acknowledges because Roy knew, Phil said, when they arrived in America on February 7th of 1964, was I not on that plane with them? So Roy Carr says, yeah, you were. And Phil goes on to say that he did all this work with the band. And he also went on to say, and if George Martin wants to take issue with it and he wants to talk to me, let's have a conversation.
He was officially involved with the Let It Be album, was he not?
Yes, it was. The story goes that my dogs are barking. Hope it's not too loud there.
That's all right.
The story goes that John Lennon and George Harrison brought Spector in to work on the Let It Be album because John said that, and this is a quote from John. I'm going to paraphrase the quote, but he said that they handed Phil Spector a bunch of tapes or a bunch of shit, a pile of shit.
Yeah.
And he said, and Phil did a great job with it. He said it was the worst recordings ever. And so
then
Phil
he also
Spector,
done John Lennon's Imagine album as well.
he worked on Imagine, the Plastic Ono Band. He worked on All Things Must Pass. So he did a lot of work that he was credited with the Beatles post their Beatle career from Let It Be on.
Yeah.
But apparently, according to Phil, before that, he was not credited, but he was highly and very involved with the band. Now, the reason why this is important is because Phil, his house band was the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would mean that the Wrecking Crew, if we are to believe what Phil is saying in this interview from 1976, was involved in recording the Beatles' music. That, to me, is a logical step to take. If Phil Spector was involved with the Beatles like he said he was, and he was working with them, probably in tandem with George Martin, and his house band, his de facto house band was the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. All we have to do is connect some very easy dots. And that's not to say that there weren't musicians back in the UK that were doing the session work too, like Big Jim Sullivan, Vic Flick. We had Ronnie Verrill.
Jimmy Page.
Jimmy Page. Yeah, that's a good one. I'm glad you brought that up. I have a person that I know, I'm going fast here, folks, because I don't want to go past the 2 hours that Billy has allotted here, who knew Dan Peake, who was one of the founding members. He knew him really well. One of the founding members of the band America. And America was produced by George Martin as well. America was one of George Martin's bands. He wrote me. We had some email exchanges going back and forth. He told me that Dan told him that Jimmy Page played the lead guitar on I Saw Her Standing There. Okay?
Well, Jimmy Page himself, I'm sure, I've read, he has admitted he was on some Beatles tracks.
Jimmy admitted to playing on Beatles albums in a post that he had on either Twitter or Instagram.
Yeah,
and people wanted to argue with me and say, no, he's probably talking about the U.S. release of A Hard Day's Night, which had some soundtrack music on it. But Jimmy didn't say he played on the soundtrack to the film. Jimmy said he played on the album. Yep. And that's a big difference. And that, the Hard Day's Night album out of the UK is 13 original, quote, compositions from the Beatles. So Jimmy Page is telling us what? That he was one of the musicians that played on the Hard Day's Night album. And then we have Bernard Purdy and the 21 tracks that he drummed on. And for all of those people that want to argue and say that, no, he drummed on the Tony Sheridan tracks, he did both. He drummed on the Tony Sheridan tracks. He was hired by Brian Epstein to put some more oomph and some more presence behind the drumming on those tracks for the U.S. market. And he also drummed on 21 Beatle tracks from the early albums. So when he talks about the early albums, we're talking about that period between 1962 and 66. I suspect that Bernard is talking about maybe the first 3 albums. Please Please Me with the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night. It could also go into later albums, but that's what I suspect. And people will say, well, can't believe Bernard because Bernard won't tell us the names of the songs. The reason why Bernard did not name the songs is because in an article, an interview that he had many years ago, he was asked about that. And he said, I'm not going to give the names of the songs because I need it as leverage to receive the compensation that I believe that I deserve today, considering where the Beatles went after I recorded those tracks. So when he first did those tracks, I think he said he was paid something like $10,000 to do the drumming, to fix the drum tracks on those songs. And then later on, he took a look at where the Beatles went. He's like, well, that's me drumming on it, and I got paid $10,000 for this stuff. So in a Martin Drummer interview, I think it was Martin Drummer going back a number of years ago, actually more than a number of years ago, a long while back, he said that their people, meaning the Beatles people, finally reached out to him and said they were going to make it right. So I think what happened was, taking a guess at this, it's probably a pretty good guess. They said to Bernard, look, we'll write you a big check, okay? but you keep your mouth shut about which songs they are. You can't talk about the songs. And so, Bernard doesn't talk about it anymore. So I think that what happened was he got the check. Bernard said, fine, I won't talk about the songs. Everybody goes home happy.
To be honest, that's a wee bit rich, because a lot of these session musicians know exactly what they're getting into. They get paid for the job, regardless of what goes on to do, but I guess he played his cards right.
Well, see, the way it works back in the day was these guys, even if you watch the documentary, The Wrecking Crew, they were going from gig to gig, recording these different songs. To them, it was just sitting down, getting the sheet music, and playing the music.
I think that even a lot of them they were creating the bass lines and,
Yes. Yeah, Carol Quay, that bass line on Good Vibrations, that's her.
Yeah.
Guys like Glenn Campbell, who was with the Wrecking Crew, Glenn would go do his own thing. These guys were brilliant session musicians. They got the job done. Now, just quickly to wrap up on Rubber Soul, Billy, if that's okay?
Yep, sure.
Okay. So let's just put the chart up where I show the timeline. On the right-hand side, I list all the songs, October and November, and how quickly the Beatles got through those songs. Yeah, that's the one right there. So I'll finish with this slide. I had more slides, but unfortunately we're out of time. So there's two problems with Rubber Soul. One is 16 songs in 30 days is not possible. We're told that the Beatles did Rubber Soul between October 11th and November 11th of 1965, and they came into the studio empty with no songs. Some people want to argue that they had partial drafts of some of the songs, like Michelle, We Can Work It Out, What Goes On, and they brought Wade in from the basic rhythm tracks from the Help sessions earlier in 1965. But the thing is, there is no proof that they had partials of Michelle. There's no proof they had a partial draft of We Can Work It Out. And with What Goes On, the official narrative tells us that they kept the chorus, that the entire song otherwise was completely revamped. So if you're going to revamp a song, it essentially means you're rewriting it. Those are some of the songs that people throw out there to say that, it wasn't 16, Mike, it was something less. I believe it was 16 because I don't believe they wrote anything. That's why I say 16. In Mark Lewison's book, The Complete Beatles Chronicles, I think the book was published in the 1980s, he tells us that it was his other book. It was the recordings, the Beatles recordings. He tells us in that book that the Beatles had to write more than a dozen songs in that 30-day period. So Mark Lewison, who is considered the Beatle historian, is telling us they had to write more than a dozen songs, which means they had to write 13, 14, 15, or 16 songs. And I'm saying 16 because, like I said, I don't believe the official narrative at all. I don't think they came in with anything. Scott Fryman, who is the musicologist and the composer that is responsible for the Decomposing the Beatles documentaries in Rubber Soul, explains to us that they came in empty. Okay, so we have a lot of sources here. We have Beatles sources, official narrative sources that are telling us that they came in empty. Now, Billy, if we can go to the one I sent you earlier today, this is the official Beatles fan magazine called The Beatles Book. And it's the Beatles' own monthly magazine. And this is edition number 27 from October of 1965. This is what it tells us. They've got to write a whole new batch of numbers, including their next single, before the end of the month. They're talking about by the time they get to the end of November. On the plane coming back from America, so they had their tour in America in August of 1965, so they're going to return on August 31st. They were talking about it, and Paul said, now they're talking about writing the songs for the album, Rubber Soul. This is what Paul says about the Rubber Soul sessions. We have nothing up our sleeves at the moment. The cupboard is definitely bare. And then the article goes on with its flop and says, but they have never let us down yet. And I know they won't this time either. So Paul McCartney, out of the horse's mouth, is saying they didn't have anything going into the Rubber Soul sessions. And for people that want to argue that they had 6 weeks in between when the tour ended and when they had to show up at EMI on October 11th of 65, in Mark Lewison's book, The Complete Beatles Chronicles, he tells us the Beatles had 6 weeks of vacation and no work, which means they weren't working on songs, which means they had to start the writing process when they got into EMI Studios on October 11th of 65, with the first day of recording being October 12th of 1965. So, Billy, if we can go back to the other chart with the you showed before with the dates. Yeah. All right, folks, a couple of things. In August of 1966, in a BBC interview, Paul said that for Revolver, it took them at least 2 weeks to try to get one song written. One song took weeks. Yet, we're to believe that 16 songs, or 12 songs, or 13, or 14, or 15 songs were written in 4 weeks. In that August 5th, 1966 BBC interview, which was the same date that Revolver was released, Paul says that we're limited as a group. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically. So how could a band that has, at that point with Revolver, 7 studio albums under their belt, being the brilliant band that they're supposed to be, how could they be limited as a group and not that good musically? For the Rubber Soul sessions, not one song took more than 5 takes to record the basic rhythm tracks. That number is ridiculous. If we fast forward to the White Album sessions in 1968, each song took dozens and dozens and dozens of takes to get it down. During that 30-day period, there were 6 days when there was no recording, and that was due to fan club obligations. That was 1 day. George Martin and Norman Smith had to mix. That was 2 days. They went out and received their MBEs from the Queen. That was 1 day. And they took 2 days out to do a TV show. In October, they recorded 8 songs in 18 days with a total of 28 takes. That's an average of 3.5 takes per song. In November, they did the remaining 8 songs because they did 16 songs for Rubber Soul. 8 songs were recorded in 13 days, in 5 less days, with a total of 14 takes for all of the songs. And that's an average of about 2 takes per song. So between October 11th and November 11th of 1965, 16 songs in 31 days, with a total of 42 takes for all of the songs, which is an average of 2.5 takes per song. So for anybody who is a songwriter or musician and has spent time in the studio recording, you know that those numbers are not even remotely close to reality. 8 of the songs were started and completed on the same day. So 8 of the 16 songs they started and completed on the very same day. And 4 songs were completed on the very last day of recording, on November 11th of 1965. Now, if we go to the calendar real quick, let me just show you how this rolled out. So the Beatles arrive on October 11th of 1965, and then the next day, Run for Your Life is in the bag. 1 day, boom, it's done. 2 days in, Drive My Car. 5 days in, Day Trippers in the bag. Then 7 days in, If I Needed Someone is completed. Norwegian Wood, 10 days in My Life, 11 days in, along with Nowhere Man. So they finish up In My Life and Nowhere Man on the exact same day on October 22nd. And We Can Work It Out, 18 days in. That's knocked out. So I won't go through November because it's the same story. If you take a look at the box at the bottom of the November chart, those are the 4 songs that they did on that last day that we're told. And 2 of those songs, You Won't See Me and Girl, we are told via the official narrative, did not exist until that day. So they had to write from scratch, rehearse, and record 2 songs on the last day, and then finish up Wait, which they had to do vocals and overdubs on. That was the song they brought in from Help. And then they had to do I'm Looking Through You, which we're told they originally started on November 6th, and they finished up on November 11th. Now, one more thing, Billy. If I Needed Someone is an interesting song because I think it was the Hollies. Yeah, it was the Hollies that did a cover of If I Needed Someone.
Just where you do that's quite interesting. In this article here, it says that they went to dub their voices for the performance at Shea Stadium.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's another important piece. Let's get to that in a moment. But If I Needed Someone, we're told that the Beatles, they started the song and then completed the song on October 18th, 7 days in.
Right.
Okay? However, the Hollies also recorded If I Needed Someone and released their version of the song on the very same day that Rubber Soul was released, on December 3rd of 1965. And of course, Rubber Soul, one of the tracks was If I Needed Someone. So here's the question. How did the Hollies have access to the song if the Beatles were writing it? If George Harrison was allegedly writing that song, how did the Hollies have access to the song? Somebody might say, well, George wrote it and then he ran over to the next studio where the Hollies were recording and showed it to them. They learned it and come on. Come on. If you believe that story, I have a bridge I can tell you. The way this song got recorded by both bands and released on the same day, on December 3rd of 1965, was the song was pre-written and the instrumental tracks were pre-recorded. So the Hollies were doing the same thing that the Beatles were doing when the Beatles were in the studio for 30 days recording Rubber Soul, and that was to record the vocals. That's what was taking place. So a lot of people don't know that. That's kind of a little weird factoid about the song If I Needed Someone, that both bands recorded it apparently at the exact same time and released on the exact same day. And then, yes, if we go to, we'll finish up with this. Brian's plan to film the Beatles' performance at Shea Stadium in America was a great success, and I hope that you will be able to see the finished result very soon. Some of the sounds were not quite right, and the boys will have to dub on their voices in the bits where the screaming prevented their vocals from being recorded. This is very important because I've been telling people for the longest time that these recordings that you see on YouTube, many of these recordings have been edited and overdubbed post-production.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, they had 2-track recorders. And with all of that screaming, let me just explain this. If the vocals got washed out with all that screaming, then also there was going to be bleed into the microphones of the bass and the guitars. Anything that was mic'd, the drums, was going to have that screaming going through their microphones. And it was going to be bleed through. That goes back to my point that these videos that people keep pointing to and saying, oh, listen to the sound quality, listen to how good they sound. That stuff was fixed up afterwards. And many times in smaller venues, the Beatles were playing to a backing track. The Beatles played on the Ed Sullivan Show. They played to a backing track. It's like the Dave Clark Five. They were on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I have a clip where the backing track failed. Uh-huh. And they were standing there. Okay, there's no music. Nobody shows up on these types of venues, the Ed Sullivan Show, without a backing track. There's too much invested. There's too much money invested. There's too much PR invested. There's too much marketing invested. You can't afford to have a failure. You can't afford to have the band fall on its face. So sorry I had to race through the back end of this thing, but hopefully people will get what I'm talking about and just go to my website, Sage of Quay, SageOfQuay, sageofquay.com, and you can go to my Polish Dead channel and you can see all my research there.
That's great, Mike. It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for coming on the show again. We'll hook up again sometime.
Thank you, Billy. Thank you so much.
Cheers now, folks. Thanks for watching. Cheers now.